It is not at all hard to take a look around us and see that the world appears to be falling apart at the seams. Abuses of power have led to society rioting at the misconduct of those that are supposed to be protecting society, while nations are rising against nations with military action being taken around the world. Natural disasters are on a steady rise of frequency and intensity, and we've all heard of the banks that have been closing and the economic uncertainty that is abounding with the cost of things going sky high. The Bible has pointed to these and other issues being the signs of the return of Christ. So, is the return of Christ soon to be at hand? If so, then what will that really look like? And what do we need to know in order to be ready for that great event? Join us now as In the Scriptures explores what the Bible has to say about these things in the series Ready or Not, Here I Come, coming to you from Andrews, North Carolina. So throughout this series of meetings, we've explored some fairly incredible things. For some of you, it has been heard many times over, and for others, these may have been the very first time that you've heard some of what has been discussed here. Well, tonight, as I said at the conclusion of our last meeting, we're going to start piecing these things together. We're going to start seeing how it is that all of these peripheral issues start coming together and form a cohesive whole, if you will. You know, one of the things that happens within Christian theology, Christian doctrine, Christian teaching, whatever it is that you want to call it, regardless of whatever church one might go to, every doctrine, every teaching that any church has needs to complement every other teaching that they have. None of them should be able to stand alone and say, well, we're going to believe this, but it doesn't really harmonize with these other things out here. Every teaching any church should have, they should all complement each other. The problem is that unfortunately, too many churches have teachings that actually contradict themselves. And so it's, well, how can we believe this if we also believe this? They seem to conflict with one another. Let me just give you a very small example of that. The other night we talked about what happens when you die. And we saw how it is that the Bible teaches that death is a sleep. Okay? It's an unconscious sleep. There's no memory. There's no cognition of anything that is going on during that period of time. For the individual, when you breathe your last, there is no perception of time. Your very next instant will be the resurrection. Now, it doesn't matter how much time has passed. For you, it'll be an instant, okay? But if the teaching that so many churches have is true, that your soul continues to live on when you die, and so then you pass away and then you go to heaven or to hell, whichever the case may be that some may hold to, then the teaching of the second coming of Christ and the resurrection is either irrelevant or contradictory to that, because the Bible tells us that in the resurrection we don't come up with these very same bodies that we have here. Our bodies are made incorruptible, immortal. Death and sorrow can't touch them anymore, okay? So it might look the same, but it's not going to be the exact same thing that we have right now. In fact, the Bible even says, what we will be, we really don't know, but what we do know is that we will be like him, like Christ, in the resurrection. Okay? But if your soul continues on after you die, then what's the point of the second coming? What's the point of the resurrection? But yet these are the things that Paul repeatedly pointed to in his letters. These were very solid. As we have seen in many of the meetings that we've had so far, these are very solid teachings that Paul had. So if we're going to believe the innate or the natural immortality of the soul, and we're going to believe in the resurrection at the second coming, these two things flatly contradict one another. Well, tonight we're going to start piecing some things together to show exactly why all of these peripheral issues that we have been talking about come together and why they're important. This is actually going to carry us through these last few nights together. You'll notice that the title of this meeting behind me says Shedding Light on Revelation Part 1. So, there's going to be a sequel to this. I'm not going to fill in all the blanks tonight, but I'll get to a few of them. As we open our Bibles this evening, we're going to spend a good amount of time in the book of Revelation. And while we're going to see see some of the same imagery that we've already encountered elsewhere in the Bible, we're also going to come across a few different things. It's going to be very similar to how we were exploring the book of Daniel, that we see things being repeated, but in the repeating, there's also additional information that's being added in to give us greater clarity, greater depth of knowledge. In exactly the same way that anybody who goes through school, when you're progressing through math, the different grade levels, even within a grade level, they don't give you the end of the math lessons at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year. You have to progressively work up to it. You have to understand the terminology, the mechanics, and so on and so forth. Well, Bible prophecy is no different, and God understands this. He gives us a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, until we have this broad depth of understanding, not only of Bible prophecy, but more importantly of God himself. We're going to be specifically this evening in Revelation chapter 13. Then I stood on the sand of the sea and saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So before we go any further, let's just take a moment and start making a visual, kind of piecing this together of what we're seeing here. First of all, does any of this sound familiar? Beasts coming out of the sea, heads, horns. This kind of reflects back to the book of Daniel, doesn't it? You'll recall from our study in Daniel chapter 7 that we had some very similar imagery. We had these beasts that were coming out of the sea. Between these 4 creatures in Daniel, there were 7 heads. Remember, the leopard had 4 heads. And here we have one beast this time, though, but he has 7 heads. And then there are these 10 horns. We have the 4th or the last beast in Daniel that had all these horns. Well, here this one beast, again, has all these horns. And there's this blasphemous name, or what's also seen as pompous words. And I have this on here. It's going to come up again as we progress. But there's more, so let's continue. Now, the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So now, of course, the list of similarities continue. Remember back from Daniel 7, we have those very same creatures that are listed, a lion, a bear, and a leopard, and they're listed here, but here they're listed in reverse order, and I'll explain why that is here in just a moment. But there's an additional detail that has just been given to us, and that is this, that the dragon gives this beast its power and its authority and its throne. Just to make sure that we're clear, Revelation 12:9 tells us who the dragon is, and that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, okay? And again, the dragon, as we see it, appears 7 times in the book of Revelation, and it's always referring to the same thing, okay? Now, let's keep going and see what else we have here. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So, to point out the obvious, one of these 7 heads gets this mortal wound, or a deadly wound, another version of the Bible might say, but that injury ends up becoming healed. Now, we're going to be piecing this together in just a moment, but we need to gather a few more details, so let's go on to the next verse. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" So at this point, we are seeing that at some point after this deadly wound is healed, masses of people give homage to this beast power, and they're flocking to do so. As we just said here, that all the world wonders after the beast. Now let's continue going. And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue 42 months. So here we come back to our list once again. Now we have those pompous words, or those speaking blasphemies, as reiterated. And we see it here again in Revelation 13 as well. Now we have another important detail added in, and that is these 42 months. Now this is also something that we see in Daniel chapter 7, but it's worded a little differently in that it's mentioned as time, times, and half a time. And I'm going to flesh this out here in just a moment so you can see how this all parallels. But let's finish gathering our details first. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So now there is more of this chapter of Revelation to come, but we're going to, for the moment, we're going to stop right here. We'll pick back up here in just a moment. But it's important for us to take a minute and kind of know who we're talking about here. So we're going to come back to our chart and we're going to plug in one more major detail, and that is this making war with the saints, which we also, again, is a detail we see from back in Daniel chapter 7. Now here, between these two columns, are 11 different points between Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 that all reflect each other, and they're showing us who it is that we are talking about. You might recall that from our study in Daniel 7 that we looked at this little horn power, and you may even recall how we were able to identify this little horn power as the Church of Rome. This is the exact same identification that the Protestant reformers were making, dating back more than 500 years. And it wasn't just the Protestant reformers. It even predates them that people were able to make the exact same identification that we were doing here. This is nothing new as far as the identity of this little horn power from Daniel 7 and who we're talking about here in Revelation 13. It's nothing new. This understanding has been around for a very long time, but it has fallen out of favor because of some things that I've shared with you already. What was called the Counter-Reformation, which put out alternative teachings to take attention away from the Church of Rome to say, no, they can't possibly be who this is. But for a long time, the church, as they're hearing these alternative teachings, they rejected them because they knew this stuff is bogus. It doesn't line up. It doesn't fit all the details. Okay? And if you remember what some of those teachings were, I had mentioned preterism is one, and that is that everything was fulfilled way, way, way in the past. And the other one is futurism, which puts everything way up in the future. And Christians, according to futurism, don't have to worry about any of this stuff because we're just going to be raptured off the earth before any of it happens. So what do we even bother studying it for? Why even bother? But I disagree with both of those positions. I believe in the historicist application, which also, I had mentioned the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther, John Wesley, John Knox, all these different individuals who were very important in kind of bringing the light of the scriptures back to the people. They all held to this very same historicist approach of Bible prophecy. That was also commonly believed to be true by the vast majority of Christians for more than 400 years, dating back a little bit, and prior to that. It is only in the much more recent times that professed Christians have moved away from these teachings. And as I was saying, they in the place of this, they have identified this little horn power as something that is yet to come, something that we don't need to give any kind of attention to. And it was meant to basically take attention away from the Church of Rome, the papal church. There's all kinds of different titles that we can use, the Roman Catholic Church, whatever you want to call it. And ultimately, the completely erroneous teachings that they were putting out about the character and the nature of God, about the Bible, about salvation, and many other things. Now, let me just pause for a moment here and say this one very important detail. We're pointing out the Church of Rome, okay? This does not mean that people who follow that persuasion are automatically bad people, or that they're evil, or whatever, or that they're demonic. I have several friends. My neighbor, somebody who has become a good friend of mine, he's Catholic, a very good individual. We hang out around the bonfire quite frequently. We just talk about different things. We've become good friends. This isn't pointing out to somebody to say, today we talk about Muslims, and it seems like we automatically just equate Muslims with bad things. But that's not what I'm doing here. I'm pointing out an erroneous system of teachings that have kind of sucked up a bunch of people into it that have just simply kind of gone along with, this is what you need to believe, and don't question us. In fact, my neighbor himself, he was just simply told, this is what you believe. Don't question us. Just believe this, and everything will be fine. His mom, took him to mass all the time, and he was an altar boy, all kinds of stuff growing up, and he told me all kinds of stories about watching the priest get drunk and all kinds of things. But this isn't about him or other Catholics being bad people. It's pointing to an erroneous system that has lied for many years to the entire world about what the Bible teaches. Note that it is this little horn power that was also speaking these pompous words back in Daniel chapter 7. What we are seeing in Revelation 13 is this amalgamation of what we read back in Daniel chapter 7. Here in Daniel 7, we have all these four different creatures, these four national powers that we pointed out: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, so on and so forth. Well, this one power that we're pointing to now in Revelation 13, the reason that it has bits and pieces of these different animals is because it shares parts of those empires within itself. That's why it has this imagery the way it is. Now follow me on this for just a moment. Daniel received the vision of Daniel 7 in about the year 552 BC. John received the vision of the book of Revelation at about 100 AD. When Daniel sees these various beasts in this vision, they're coming up as the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then this terrible beast, and so on and so forth. It's like he's looking down a timeline. John is at the other end of that timeline, looking again at still as what to come, but he's also seeing that it has pieces of these other empires that have risen. So he's at a different point in time seeing the exact same thing. So he sees it in reverse order. Now there are some details, as I've mentioned before, that in the book of Daniel, they start getting a little foggy the further down time goes. And God did that intentionally because he knew, God, that he was going to raise up the Apostle John, give him the vision of the book of Revelation, and a lot of the foggy details from Daniel would end up becoming clearer then, and then moving on down to the book of Revelation, because they were closer in time. Now, each and every one of these empires had their time and their power, and they all rose to power, and they all fell off to the pages. And this was true for the Roman Empire as well. But Rome ended up collapsing in around about the year 476 AD. And it wasn't really too long after that that the world was plunged into what we call the Dark Ages. And these began in about the year 538 AD. Now, there are several reasons why it is that this took place. The Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages not because somebody turned the lights off, but because there were aspects of humanity that were suppressed. Things such as the arts, common education, the ability to read and to write. Illiteracy went rampant throughout the nations of Europe. Superstition became wide-ranging, and this had impact for years to come. How many of you have ever heard of something called the Salem witch trials? It's something it's a pretty common aspect of American history, but the Salem witch trials it happened because of the superstitions developed in the European nations that came with the European explorers over to America. And this whole idea of science was they didn't see it as science, they saw it as witchcraft. How can you possibly take a root out of the ground and grind it into something and create a healing balm out of that? You must be a witch. And they used completely ridiculous reasoning to come to determining who was a witch. Something as silly as, we'll throw this person in a big pot of water, and if she floats, then she's a witch. Well, that's dumb. How many people will float when you put them in a big pool of water? Most everybody would. But incidentally, so these superstitions became what we think of as common knowledge, but they were all ridiculous ideas. They became that way because education was taken away from the masses. Now, that doesn't mean education completely disappeared. People could still go if you could afford to pay for the education. But the education, so it was only available really to those who could afford it, and it was tightly controlled, what you could know and what you could believe. But every so often there were individuals who could see how there were some brilliant people that they had under their tutelage, and they would expose them to the things that they weren't supposed to share, the books that they weren't supposed to read, the exposure. Martin Luther was one of those kinds of individuals. There's plenty of people who showed themselves as being brilliant-minded people, and the professors, who were also kind of under the control of these hierarchies, said, you know what, this is a brilliant mind, and I'm not going to constrain him. I'm going to let him free and expose him to all this information because I know he can do something with this that's good. But there was also an important event that accompanied this beginning of the Dark Ages in the year 538 AD as well. Even though the Empire of Rome had collapsed, that didn't stop them from trying to rebuild it again. They tried, and it didn't really go anywhere. And it was in the year 538 AD that a tribe known as the Goths were in control of the city of Rome. How many of you have ever heard the term Gothic? Okay? It comes from this tribe of the Goths. Apparently they were, very much enamored with the dead, and they were always kind of, worshiping the dead and so on and so forth. And so that's where the term Gothic comes from, okay? Well, these guys, this tribe, they were kind of in control of the city of Rome in the year 538. The Goths, however, were defeated by a gentleman by the name of General Belisarius. They were pushed out of Rome. Emperor Justinian then ended up taking and transferring political power to the Pope at that time. Justinian then takes off and goes to the city of Constantinople, which would eventually become, that was known as the Eastern Roman Empire. It would become known as the Byzantine Empire. But he ends up leaving, and in the process of him leaving Rome, he gives the Pope, who already had all of this religious control over people, he gives him political control as well. Now, we think, well, what's the big deal? Religious control and political control condensed into one single individual. That seems very efficient, doesn't it? And incidentally, God's kingdom works that way too. But there's also a big problem in that God's kingdom doesn't have the problem of sin, whereas all human kingdoms do, because all humans do. So when you take religious control and political control and unite it into a single individual and season it well with the curse of sin, it's a recipe for disaster every time. And that's exactly what we saw happen in world history. Now, while the imperial Roman power had collapsed, from the ashes of that once great empire rose the Roman Catholic Church, which would end up with greater power than what the Caesars had. But this also did not last forever. You see that date at the other end of that chart. It says 1798 AD. It was in the late 1790s that there was something going on in Europe that ended up threatening and crippling the Church of Rome, and it's what we call the French Revolution. The French Revolution was led by a guy by the name of Napoleon. In the year 1798, Napoleon had one of his generals named Berthier march into the Vatican and take Pope Pius VI captive at that time, dethroned him. He was actually in the middle of some kind of like an anniversary ceremony in the Sistine Chapel. Berthier walked in, said, "You're coming with me," and that was the end of it. That pope ended up dying in captivity. He was by no means the first pope to ever be taken captive, but when he had been taken captive, the clout and the pull that the Church of Rome had was broken for quite a few years to come. They lost all their sway over these other empires and the other nations within Europe. To give you an example of what kind of power the church had, at one point in time there was a German king who said, "I don't want to really give my allegiance to the church anymore. They're requiring too much of us. They're just really being very dictatorial, and I don't want to give my allegiance to them anymore." Well, the papacy basically said, "Okay, you can do that if you want. Oh, by the way, anybody else over there in that region who wants to have a shot at the throne, you go for it, and we'll back you as long as you swear allegiance to us." Well, suddenly this German king said, "Uh-oh, I can't have that. That means somebody's going to be challenging me for my throne." So he ended up having to go to the Pope's Winter Palace to apologize to the Pope. This is a king who had to travel to the Pope's Winter Palace to apologize to him, but the Pope made him stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days before he would allow him to have an audience. Now, who do you think has more power, the king or the Pope, to make somebody do that? To make a king do that. And it wasn't just this kind of guy that they had power. They had power over almost every reigning monarch throughout Europe. And it spread from there, by the way. Now, why is any of this important? Well, you'll recall from our study in Daniel that in prophetic terms, especially in the language that is clearly symbolic, when we talk about these timelines, these days, that a day equals a year in Bible prophecy. Remember how in Daniel 7 there was that time period of a time, times and half a time. And the exact same phrase ends up appearing also in Revelation 12, verse 14. So the time is a symbolic way of referring to a year. This is clearly established in Daniel chapter 4 with the story of Nebuchadnezzar when he kind of loses his mind and lives as a beast for 7 years. But there the phrase is until 7 times pass over him. Times, and incidentally in the Hebrew language it's written as 2. They have a grammatical thing called a dual, meaning 2. And that's what this is written as, 2 times. So we can know that it's talking about 2 rather than 3 or 4. Would be 2 years. Thus, this is a reference to a period of 3.5 years. Time, 1, 2 times, and then a half a time, 3.5. And this was for the people to whom the Bible was written to would have understood this language because they used what's called, this is the Jewish people, they used a lunar calendar, which is a little bit different than the solar calendar that you and I have been accustomed to for quite a few years. So in a lunar calendar, the lunar cycle is 29.5 days. In fact, if you were to look today at a current kind of Jewish calendar, the months will go 29 days one month, 30 days the next month, 29 days the next month, 30 days, and it just keeps going like that. Now, it's not too hard to see how that would create a problem in keeping in line with the solar cycles because you end up falling short a few days every year. So the simple fix to that is that every 5 or 6 years, they throw in an extra month. In the exact same way that we have a leap year, every 4 years we throw in an extra day to make up for the fact that our solar cycle is actually 365 and 1/4 days. Okay? So it's not like this is some foreign gobbledygook that I'm trying to throw at you. This is very legitimate. But being 29.5 days in prophetic language, what we do is we just simply round that 29.5 up to the nearest whole number. So 29.5 becomes 30 days. Now, watch what happens. 3.5 years has how many months to it? It's 42 months, just like what we read in Revelation chapter 13. 42 months with 30 days to each month equals how many days? It comes up to 1,260 days. Using that day for a year principle that was clearly laid out for us back in the book of Daniel and in other Old Testament passages, as well as a few New Testament ones, 1,260 days turns into a literal time period of 1,260 years. And from the year 538 AD down to the year 1798 AD, how many years do you have? Well, it's not too hard to figure out. You have 1,260 years. Here we have that little horn power that Daniel saw in his vision being the same power that John is seeing in his vision of Revelation chapter 13. The reasons John saw the different parts from the lion and the bear and so on were because the Church of Rome shared many aspects of these pagan empires. Now let's come back to our comparison chart of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 and note that the second line from the top says 7 heads. In Daniel 7, there are those 4 beasts, and one of them has 4 heads. The bear has 1 head, the lion has 1 head. There's no mention of multiple heads on any of those. The great terrible beast, again, no mention of multiple heads on that. So they all have 1 head, but then the leopard has 4 heads, so between those 4 creatures, you have 7 heads. But in Revelation 13, one of those heads gets mortally or deadly, gets this deadly wound. But we're also told that the deadly wound is healed. Now, when General Berthier took Pope Pius VI captive in 1798, that was the deadly wound being inflicted upon this head. But that wound would be healed. That's what the text said to us, right? And that actually happened in real time in February of 1929. Interestingly, one of the things that we should be marking in our own mind is how the dates are slowly marching closer to our present day, aren't they? 1798, remember a few nights ago, 1844, 1929, the dates are slowly marching down to our present day, aren't they? But in February of 1929, this was when Mussolini agreed to return the papal seat of power in the signing of what's called the Concordat of Italy. Now, take a look at this. This is a newspaper that comes from that very event. Note the headline there. It says, Mussolini and Gaspari sign historic Roman pact. Now, this is a quote. You'll actually, if you're really paying attention, you may even see a misprint in the quote. But notice how it says this. The Roman question tonight was a thing of the past and the Vatican was at peace with Italy in affixing the autographs to the memorable document, Healing the Wound. Isn't that very interesting wording? Extreme cordiality was displayed on both sides. Now, friends, as we read that excerpt from the article, Healing the Wound, does this sound like God kind of knew what he was talking about when he's using the words he's using to describe these different events? Now, I have a question for you. We can see that the beast power from both Daniel and Revelation is the Church of Rome. But why is that important? What difference does it make for us today? Will this knowledge pay our rent? Will it put food on our table or keep your telephone turned on or keep your gas in your car? Well, there's something very sobering that we need to keep in mind. All who dwell on the earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. This ought to make us sit up and take a bit of a notice. All will worship whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life. Believe it or not, there is more to come. Now, later in this very same chapter, there's another beast that rises up. That's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow night. But this second beast does something very particular. Look at what this second beast does. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on the right hand or on the foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So right here we're getting into this whole mark of the beast thing, okay? And there's all kinds of speculation as for what that mark of the beast is. But friends, it's really not hard for us to figure out what it is. But before I get into the actual mark of the beast, and I'm going to talk about that, because I think it's important for us to touch on something that is related to it, though. Let's go back to verse 16 again. What is it that we see that this beast power does? This second beast power, he causes all. And again, like I said, we're going to identify who this second beast power is tomorrow night. But what is it that this second beast does? He causes all to do what? To receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. Now, let's put aside, first of all, the notion that this is talking about a tattoo or a computer chip or anything like that, because it has nothing whatsoever to do with anything of that nature. And we'll talk about that mark in just a moment. But the issue that I want us to look at right now is this. For quite some time, it was considered, notice how the language of these texts that we've been looking at is all the world does this. All the world is caused to worship after the beast. And then this second beast power comes up and it says, he causes all. For the longest time, it was thought impossible for something like this to happen, to make the entire world do something. There isn't one single thing across the entire planet on any context that you can think of that every nation does the same. Even breathing is done differently from one nation to another in some cases, okay? So the whole idea of trying to get the whole world to do one thing is this whole idea of trying to herd cats. It's impossible to make that happen. That was the thinking, though, anyway. But if there's anything that the last 3 years has taught us, is that if you start using the right kind of language and the right kind of pressure, you can make everybody do anything. Almost anybody, that is. It has shown us how it's not that hard, as once thought, to make the masses of people fall in line with a particular line of action, especially if you use language of, it's for the greater good. Even as we sit here tonight, right now, I don't know how many of you have been keeping up with some of the news stories, but there are those, now notice what some of those texts were saying, that no one may buy or sell. Okay, and we're going to come back to that. But right now, as we sit here tonight, there are people who are wanting control of your money. Okay? Not to spend it for themselves, but to control you. Okay? They want to determine how much you can spend, what you can spend it on, or even if you can spend it at all. Okay? I don't know how many of you have heard the story of how it is that the federal government has pushed through that banks, all banks, have to report any transaction you do over $600 to the IRS. Okay? Any transaction that you do over $600. Now, how many of us have common transactions that we do every month that exceed $600? A mortgage payment, your rent, maybe a car payment, depending on what kind of car you have. If you withdraw cash, well, I know people who they get their Social Security check, they don't leave the money in the bank, they pull all the cash out and they keep it in the pocket. That gets reported to the IRS. So it makes the IRS say, what are you doing with your money? There are efforts moving at warp speed to try to get everybody to a cashless society, okay? It's been happening for years. One of those groups is called the World Economic Forum. This is a group that's comprised of the wealthiest people in the world. They're headquartered in Switzerland. I'm not making this up. This is not science fiction. This is stuff that if you've been listening to different kinds of radio commentators, they have been putting this stuff out there for the public to hear and to know. These are the people who every year get together and they discuss how are we going to manipulate the economy of the world. And they always discuss global economics. In fact, this particular group here at the World Economic Forum was a huge part of everything that happened with the whole COVID-19 crisis. How can I possibly say that? Well, I'll show you here in just a minute. In fact, they have been working hard for some time to try to reimagine world economics. Check this out. The president of this World Economic Forum, his name is Klaus Schwab. This is a statement that he has made, and you can find this on the website for the World Economic Forum. The pandemic, talking about COVID-19, represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset the world. Now, this might not sound like something that's so terrible, but then when you get to actually know what they're talking about reimagining, suddenly it doesn't really sound so wonderful anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that this group is the beast power Revelation 13, but what I am saying is that we can see how the kind of logic that has gone into this that suddenly doesn't make it so hard to see how we can enforce regulations upon people to control economic factors. Okay? There's already tools in place where people can shut off your bank account and you don't even know it. It's already there. It's just who you're going to give control of that to. The tools, the pieces are all in place. They're already there. This isn't some conspiracy theory. They're already there. If a credit card company, they call it fraudulent activity. If they detect fraudulent activity on your credit card, they shut your credit card off. And then you go to use it. They don't tell you. You go to use it, and it doesn't work. They can already shut off your ATM card. If they detect what they think is fraudulent activity, bam, they shut it off. You might get a phone call, maybe, but it's more times you learn about it when you try to go to use that card, that debit card, and you find out it doesn't work. And then you have to call them to say, what's up? The pieces are all there. It's just a matter of what's going to cause this final push to happen. So now let's ask the big question that everybody wants to know. What is the mark of the beast? Now before I answer that, I want to share a text with you. Then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. This sounds serious, doesn't it? He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. So right here in this text, this is the single greatest curse in the entire Bible. The wrath of God poured out full strength upon those who receive this mark of the beast. Now, does it stand to make sense? You know, the Bible tells us that God is just and he's fair. Does it stand to make sense that God would pronounce this tremendous curse upon people and then not let you find out what this mark of the beast is? That he would hide it from you. And then we have to kind of speculate and run around like, oh, I hope I don't catch the mark of the beast, like we're trying to avoid some kind of cold or flu or something like that. Okay? God obviously is going to make it so that we can figure it out. Now, with that in mind, let's return back to Revelation chapter 13. Here is wisdom. Here is what? Wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. So notice, first of all, that 666 is not the mark of the beast. It's not a tattoo, nothing like that. Rather, it is the number of the beast. And it's also called the number of a man, as we see it there, particularly the man who is at the head of this beast power. All of this is important to figure out what that mark of the beast is. This number of a man is also kind of referenced in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3, talking about the man of sin and the son of perdition. Now, watch this. We've already established who this beast power is in Revelation 13, right? It's the Church of Rome, or the Catholic Church. The head of that church is what? It's the Pope, right? So there's an ancient document called the Donation of Constantine. Within this document, there is a title that's ascribed to the Pope, Vicarius Filii Dei. The term vicarious, it means a representative. We use that same term, living vicariously through somebody else, okay? It means representative of the Son of God. That's what that term means. Now, the document was found, of course, to be a forgery. It was found to be fake. But the church did use it to confiscate land from people, to take possessions away, even though it was found to be a forgery. But the Church of Rome also did end up using that very title, which they go out of their way to say, no, that is not one of the official titles of the Pope. Vicar of Christ, or Vicarius Christi, that is one of the official titles of the Pope. But they'll say, no, that's not one of the official titles of the Pope at all, this Vicarius Filii Dei. But they've used this title in their own publications. And incidentally, this is from the Latin language, the language from which we get Roman numerals, letters that have numerical value. Also, Greek and Hebrew happen to work the exact same way. Now, there's all kinds of discussion regarding the legitimacy of this being applied to the Pope. But here's what happens. This title of Vicarius Filii Dei has appeared in publications. It's appeared in even as late as April of 1915 and also in August of 1941 in their own publications. They've used it. So when you look at the Roman numerals from this title, you come up with the number 666. It's really not that hard to figure this out. So this number 666 is actually pointing to the Pope of Rome. Now check out what has been said regarding the Pope of Rome. Remember how in our comparison chart we were looking at speaking pompous words or speaking blasphemies, right? And we've already pointed out in these meetings that blasphemy is being a man but claiming to be God. That was one of the accusations that was hurled at Christ. For a good work, we don't try to kill you. We don't try to stone you. But you, for blasphemy, you being a man, make yourself God. Okay? Now with Jesus, that wasn't a problem because he truly was. But look at what some of the statements have been made regarding the papal seat. We hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty. That was from Pope Leo VIII in 1894. That should make at least one eyebrow go up. You know that I am the Holy Father, the representative of God on earth, the vicar or the representative of Christ, which means that I am God on the earth. That comes from Pope Pius XI. And I'm sorry, I don't have a quote for when this statement was made, but Pope Pius XI sat in the papal seat from 1922 to 1939. And here's one more. Have no fear. Incidentally, before I read this quote, who is it that's saying this? It's at the bottom. Pope John Paul II. Now that's a name that almost all of us should recognize, right? 1995. If I'm young enough to remember it, I'm sure the rest of us are. But look what it says here. Have no fear when people call me the Vicar of Christ, or when they say Holy Father or Your Holiness. You know why he's taking those titles? Because again, he's taking upon himself the position of God on earth. Does that sound like pompous words? Does that sound blasphemous? People have said far less and had the accusation of blasphemy hurled at them. But yet there's more. Let's look back once again at our chart of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, because there's one more detail to be included here. Recall from Daniel 7:25 that little horn would intend to change times and law. So what law is in question here? It obviously has to be regarding God's law, because human laws are irrelevant to God. Human laws change all the time. They can be manipulated. They're different from one nation to another in many cases. So God's law is what is at stake when it's being talked about here in Daniel chapter 7. So did the papal church ever intend to change God's law? Well, we've kind of already addressed this question before, but let's refresh our memories. Which is the Sabbath day? This comes from the Convert's Catechism of the Catholic Church. Saturday is the Sabbath day. Why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? We observe Sunday instead of Saturday because the Catholic Church in the Council of Laodicea in AD 336 transferred the solemnity from Saturday to Sunday. Now, real quick, I just want to make a quick point here. There's a little bit of history to this. Notice how that year 331 is being used. In the year 321, did I say 331? 336, I'm sorry, 336 AD. In the year 321, Constantine was the Roman emperor at the time. He was somebody who claimed to be a convert to Christianity, even claimed to receive a vision that God had given him to use the sign of the cross and to go and to conquer his armies with, or his enemies. And so he did. So he claimed to become a Christian. He held a council and ended up instituting what's called the First Sunday Laws, which he ordered all the businesses in the city to be closed. You know, if you were a farmer working outside in the country, you know, that's one thing because farm work has to be done every day. But all the businesses had to be closed up for what they called the Venerable Day of the Sun. Talking about the sun in the sky, okay? Now, prior to that, there was a small group of Christianity that started to observe Sunday for a very particular reason. The Jewish people, particularly around Jerusalem, were always a thorn in the side of the Romans. They were always rebelling, always pushing back. And so the Romans started getting pretty tired of all of this. So they figured, hey, we know where these rebel rousers are every Saturday. They're in their synagogue. We know they're not going to have their swords in there, so we're just going to go there and take them captive without a fight, and then the problem will be over. Well, the problem was that there would be some followers of Christ also in the synagogues who would be caught up and carried away with these Jewish rebels who had nothing to do with what the Jews were doing. So the Christians started to kind of separate themselves from the Jewish people, and one of the reasons why also is the Jewish leadership, they kind of knew who these followers of the way were. That's the term that they used, and so they started making it very hard for them to be a part of the worship service. So these small number of Christians would not gather on the Sabbath with the Jewish believers, and they would gather in caves at times, and sometimes in catacombs. And they do this on the first day of the week. They never venerated the first day of the week. They never made it holy. They just gathered for worship in an effort to escape persecution from the Romans who were going after the Jewish rebels. That's all they were trying to do. And this was a very small group of people. But it started a habit that kind of spread ever so slightly. And then by the time you get to the city of Rome, a couple hundred years later, under the Emperor Constantine, he then issues this law. And the Catholic Church is already a thing at this point in time. And so he's kind of given a wink and a nod to the Pope, who doesn't have all that same authority yet as what Justinian gives him 200 years later. But it's something that starts to make Christianity then a publicly backed religion of the Romans. Now, some Christians said hallelujah because it meant that Christian persecution came to an end, at least for a little while, because now it became the state religion. But once that happened, a whole big flood of pagan corruption started coming into the Christian church. And it went full tilt for many years after that. All these things that we have been talking about, death being asleep, hell is not a place that is burning right now. It's actually an event that is the destruction of sin and sinners. All these ideas of hell is burning at this very moment, it's going to burn forever, and the dead, your soul is immortal, all that comes from the pagan corruption that came into the church. Christians didn't believe that in the first century. Pagans did. And incidentally, when the church finally said, you know what, as we said here, transferred the solemnity, the holiness of the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. It may have been a tradition that a few people were doing, but the church said, we're going to exercise our authority over the Bible and over God himself, for that matter, and we're going to take the holiness of the Sabbath and we're going to put it on the first day of the week, and we're going to say it's in honor of the resurrection. But the real reason was because they wanted to convert pagans to Christianity, and so they paganized Christianity in order to make it more palatable for the pagans to become a part of the church. That's just simply what they did, which is also why they started bringing all of these statues into the churches and renaming them to Christian saints, which is why you have something like Jupiter, the god Jupiter, who gets renamed Peter, Saint Peter. This is legit history. Any one of you can Google this stuff and find it. And so they started bringing all of these things into the church, and it just stuck because you have this huge wave of people who called themselves Christians who were never converted, that just brought their pagan ideas into the church. And the church used that to find a few obscure texts in the Bible to say, oh yeah, you have to pay the church money in order to not go to hell. In fact, I tell you what, we'll make a great deal for you. Here's what we call an indulgence. You pay for this, you've got yourself a guaranteed seat into heaven. And just in case you're wondering if a loved one that you may have had that's already died is already suffering in hell, you can buy one for them too. And that's their ticket to heaven. And incidentally, that's how the Sistine Chapel was funded, was through the selling of indulgences. And the church made big money off of this, and they were banking on the ignorance of people who just didn't know any better. But there's more. Have you any other way of proving that the church has power to institute festivals or precept? Had she not such power, she could not have done that in which all modern religionists agree with her. She could not have substituted the observance of Sunday, the first day of the week, for the observance of Saturday, the seventh day of the week, a change for which there is no scriptural authority. And one more quote here. The Catholic Church, by virtue of her divine mission, changed the day from Saturday to Sunday. So the Church of Rome clearly admits that they had made this attempt to change God's law. Now, unfortunately, it's just an attempt, because God's law can't be changed, which is why Christ had to go to the cross, because it can't be altered. It cannot be changed. Or better yet, they had intended to change the Sabbath. But the fact is that the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. It's Saturday. It always has been, and it always will be. But there's one more quote that I would like you to see. Note the wording of this statement. Of course, the Catholic Church claims the change was her act, and the act is a mark of her ecclesiastical power and authority in religious matters. Ooh, that should send a chill up your spine right there. Again, does it seem like God knew what he was talking about in the way that he instructed John to write the book of Revelation, and he used the terminology that he's using? Friends, the church openly admits that they tried to make this change. When some ask if Saturday is the Sabbath and why do we go to church on Sunday, it's for no other reason than because of a human tradition that was put in place during the time of the Roman Empire many, many years ago. Now, here's one more thing I want to kind of just give you a little food for thought. We think we are so advanced right now technologically, and we are in many respects. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Apollo 11 mission, right? The rocket that shot off into space. And even that technology advanced into becoming the space shuttle, right? The booster rockets, the solid, the fuselage, and the shuttle and all that kind of stuff. Do you know that the construction of the space shuttle was influenced by the Roman Empire that existed 1,000 years prior to the space shuttle being made? Well, how is that possible? Well, the Romans had roads. That's one thing that they did, is they made roads. That whole term, all roads lead to Rome. Well, it comes from the Roman Empire and the work in making roads that they did. Some of those roads, well, they're made out of cobblestone. You can still find them. The only reason they still exist is because nobody drives on them. But a lot of those roads were just tracks made by mules pulling a cart. Okay? And they're made the distance that they are because of the yoke that they would put on the donkeys or whatever it is that they're using, and it kind of made those ruts at that distance between the mules and the wheels of the carts that they would pull. Well, eventually, as time progressed, those same yokes were brought to the New World, what would become the United States. They were used here to also make some roads. Well, eventually, train tracks started to become a thing because locomotives were being used. Well, in many cases, railroads were laid down on those very same roads that mules had made before. And they just laid those rail tracks down in the exact same ruts that the animals had made, pulling those carts. So which means that it kind of dictated how big the trains were. And then, of course, they built the tunnels and so on and so forth that the trains would pass through certain mountains. Well, the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle were built in one place and then transported by train over to where they would be attached to the space shuttle, and they had to go through some of those tunnels along the way. So they had to make sure that these boosters would fit through those tunnels. So something that is as technologically advanced as the space shuttle was dictated by the distance between two donkeys. Now we think we're so advanced, but ancient history still influences us today. Now we think, well, these things that we're doing they're just common knowledge. Everybody's doing it. But why? Is that a question that anybody is even asking anymore? Why do we do this? Is it because of an ancient tradition that somebody else put in place hundreds of years ago, or is it something that is solidly rooted on the Word of God? Some will claim that Christ made the change to his Sabbath when he died on the cross. But he did not die on the cross to remove the one commandment of the 10 that clearly points to him being the sovereign creator of all things. He did not die on the cross to alter the 10 commandments. He died on the cross to pay for our sins for breaking the 10 commandments and to fulfill that portion of the law that pointed to him being the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Jesus rose on the first day of the week, yes, but he at no point ever said that this becomes a new day of worship or a new Sabbath. That is a human tradition. Jesus rose from the grave on the third day to prove and to guarantee that for those who believe in him, that they too can be raised from the dead when Christ appears again. Remember what it was that Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And also this, in Matthew chapter 5, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Friends, all has not yet been fulfilled. Jesus is still wanting to have you hear his voice to keep his 10 commandments. We're going to look a bit more fully into this in the next few meetings together, but what you want to know right now, what I want to ask you right now is, after this message is over, if you have questions of anything that we've gone through so far, feel free to ask. But friends, here's the real point. Jesus is coming back, and he will execute judgment upon those who try to stand above him. The arrogant and the proud will not rejoice when Jesus returns, but he wants you to be one of those who do rejoice at his return. Jesus is asking for you to gaze upon his cross and to hold faith in his name rather than in the traditions of men. The question is, will you take hold and trust and obey the leading of his voice tonight? Because Jesus is coming back for those who will obey here and now. If you will obey him here and now, then you will obey him in that kingdom to come. Will you trust his grace and heed his voice to follow him? During the first Battle of Bull Run, civilians brought picnic lunches to watch the battle, which ended up a Confederate victory. The civilian traffic hindered the retreating Union troops, which turned into a scene of panic and chaos. The civilians came thinking one thing, but left thinking something else very different. The Bible tells us of a great crowd that once gathered to hear Jesus teach, but when he began talking about some very deep topics, many of them left disappointed. They too came thinking one thing, but also left thinking something else very different. When he asked his disciples if they were going to leave as well, Peter replied, "To whom will we go? You have the words of eternal life." Sometimes the teachings of the Bible can be challenging as they lead to eternal life. But we cannot approach those teachings with preconceived ideas. Rather, we need to allow ourselves to be shaped by what the Bible says. I'm Craig Fish, and let's remember to live every day according to what is in the Scriptures.